12:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of the other members of our subcommittee, Vanessa and Shira and Steve, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Brown Bag Lunch lecture series. This is part 1 of 2. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'll do a little promotion here and we'll get into today's talk. Okay. Let's see if this will work. All right, so today's part 1 on turning your dissertation into a book. I'd like to bring everyone's attention to part 2 as well. Today is going to be from the perspective of companies, and on April 8th, we are at the same time at 12:30, we're going to be hearing from Tiffany and Chris and Connie on their experiences getting their works actually published. A few other things that are upcoming to put on your calendars. In October and November, I guess at the ASOR session, we are doing, Early Career Scholars Committee is doing a new session on breaking new ground in ancient studies, research by emerging scholars. This is going to be a session in person and virtual, where we're wanting emerging scholars who are beginning their careers or at least are new at presenting papers at conferences. It's an opportunity to get some experience with mentoring and professionalization. And yeah, so we're hoping to get some new exciting papers on there, and that deadline's been extended to April 1st, so you can feel free to commit to that if you haven't done so and are interested. And then finally, we have Career Scholars, we're doing a new series called Research in Action. And the first in that series is going to be on April 22nd over lunch as well. It's going to be by Katie A. Paul, who's the co-director of the ASOR project on the role of social media platforms and antiquities trafficking. So that's going to be really interesting. So please tune into that as well. All right. So today we are going to be hearing from Beatrice Rehl, who's an editor-publisher at Cambridge University Press. You can see there, I'm not going to go through all of it, but she has a whole bunch of different subjects that she covers and subtopics within those subjects. I'll let her talk about that. And we also have Katie Chin, who's an acquisitions editor at Brill, focusing on the ancient Near East and Egypt. And so they are going to share their experiences with us. Each of them is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we have a little bit of time in between for some prepared questions. And then at the end, we will have an open Q&A time. Please, throughout the process, be putting your questions into the chat. We have a lot of people today, and so we think that will be the best way to do it. And then we'll look through it and make sure that we get your questions covered that way as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here and hand it over to Beatrice.
Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this workshop. So I'm going to start with my response to one of the questions that was put forward, and that is, what is the one thing I wish early career scholars and authors knew about before starting the publication process? So I actually have 2 responses to that question. The first is, the size of the market for your book is small. Academic work is very specialized. It will not appeal to a large public. Indeed, there is no such thing as a general public that will buy a focused scholarly work aimed at scholars and advanced students. Moreover, not every library in the universe is going to buy your book. It will be purchased by libraries that already have strong holdings on the ancient Near East, and those universities that have programs on the ancient Near East and classical studies, and that usually are one and the same. And my second point here is that the dissertation is not the book. And the lightly revised dissertation is also not the book, your advisor's comments and advice notwithstanding. So why? Okay, so I think the first thing to do is to describe what a typical dissertation is. From what I have seen, and indeed I remember from my own work, It is a first synthesis of primary and secondary materials. Rarely does the dissertation have an overall argument that is systematically argued and sustained throughout the work. Usually the dissertation is on a very narrow topic so that the student can focus the research and get the dissertation written within about a 3-year period. A great dissertation topic, however, will provide scope for future research and serve as the foundation for publication of several articles and at least one book. The dissertation is the academic equivalent to a driver's license. It enables the student to enter the field as a professional, but it is important to remember that it is still student work. The book requires a new and a different level of thinking. So just the way that intellectual maturity develops while one is studying for PhD exams and writing the dissertation, so the book represents a new level of thinking and intellectual problem solving. Now, in contrast to the dissertation, the book is where you, the author, put your own stamp on the subject, where you offer a new interpretation of the evidence, or where you identify a new problem, theme, or topic. It is a work where you identify a new intellectual problem, formulate an argument, amass the evidence to support it, and explain how and why it changes our understanding of a given topic. In other words, you need to answer the so what question. Recent Cambridge books that fit this description are The Origins of Money in the Iron Age Mediterranean, A History of Hittite Literacy, and the Imperialization of Assyria. Let me give you an example of the difference between a dissertation and a book. Some years ago, a recently minted PhD got in touch with me regarding her dissertation. It focused, this was an art history dissertation, it focused on a single painting by an important 16th century Italian artist. But unfortunately, the painting had been destroyed in a fire in the 19th century. So I knew instinctively that a book that focuses on a single painting that no longer exists and was not by a name artist such as Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, that was going to be a very tough sell in the marketplace. So I asked the author about the themes that she explored in her analysis of the painting, and she reported that it was the starting point for a broader study of religious painting in Venice after the Reformation, but before the Council of Trent. So I suggested that she work on this broader topic and to include a fuller range of artists and artworks, including the one that had been destroyed, but fortunately known through a 19th century photograph. So the author did just that, and the book went on to get very, very strong reviews and also to sell well. So now I'd like to turn to some of your other questions about, and specifically about when and how to approach a publisher. Which publishers? Select your publishers carefully. Look at the books in your bibliographies and check for their publishers. Look at the publisher catalogs that you pick up at the ASOR or other professional society meetings. Check publisher websites for their lists. The odds are that a press that has a program of publications in your area will be most inclined to be interested in your work because that press already has an editorial program as well as a marketing and a sales infrastructure in place, and they know how to sell those kinds of books. So it just does not make sense to send your project to a publisher, even one that you have your heart set on publishing with, if that publisher does not have a program in your area. When should you approach a publisher? Currently, several university presses and commercial publishers will offer a contract to a first book author based on a proposal or a proposal plus a few chapters. In these situations, the contract stipulates, or often stipulates, that the final manuscript will be subject to approval by external peer reviewers, and at which point it can be rejected. Here is my view on this situation based on my experience. Our peer reviewers offer very thoughtful and constructive feedback, but they are also very tough. In my experience, the peer review verdict for more than 50% of first books, even when the reviewers have read a full manuscript, is revise and resubmit. For incomplete manuscripts, the verdict is always revise and resubmit. Now, I know that in a tough job market, there is a lot of pressure on early career scholars to start publishing, even while in graduate school. This was unheard of when I was a graduate student, so this is a fairly new phenomenon. Practices among publishers vary widely. As I have noted, some publishers will offer a first-time author a contract based on an incomplete manuscript. If you really need to publish, you will find a publisher. But remember, a book is forever. You don't want to publish something before it is ready. You don't want to read negative reviews of your work, and you do not want to look back on it with embarrassment 10 years after publication. A weak scholarly debut can cast a shadow on a career, just the way that a brilliant scholarly debut can shape a career. What to submit to a publisher? When you are ready to contact a publisher, do not send the manuscript. You should send a 5 to 7 page single-spaced proposal or thereabouts, some shorter, some longer, but a proposal that outlines what is new and important about your scholarship. You should describe your book, but just keep the description short and to the point. A description that goes on for pages and pages suggests that you do not know what book you are writing because you were unable to distill it down to the essentials. The proposal should also include a table of contents with chapter abstracts, and if relevant, you should indicate how many illustrations your work will require. I note that anything above about 60 or even 70 illustrations is somewhat unrealistic unless there's subvention funding to help to cover the cost of a very, very large illustration program. You should also indicate the subjects and the readership for your book, but do not tell the publisher about the size of the market and how many copies it will sell. I routinely get a proposal that says 5 million people will buy this book, and that is absolutely not the case. I'm sorry to say, I wish it were so. You, the author, do not have that information. The editor has databases full of statistics on comparable titles that enable her or him to assess the size of the market for the book and the viability of your project. Now, you could also give your proposal to an editor at a professional society meeting, such as ASOR. A piece of advice, if you do that, put your name and contact information on it. I return from conferences with many, many proposals, and easily 90% of them do not have a name and address on them. Now, editors are a very, very bright group, but they will not necessarily attach a name and a face to a proposal during an event during which they are likely to speak with hundreds of scholars. Now, many early career scholars and even advanced scholars often ask whether they can submit a proposal to more than one publisher. This is absolutely permissible, but the correct etiquette is to inform each publisher that you are doing so. I also note that some publishers will not compete for work by a first book author. If you do send out a proposal to multiple publishers, please make sure to change the name of the editor and the name and address of the publishing house in the cover letter or the email message. I can't tell you how many times I have received letters addressed to Beatrice Rehl, Oxford University Press, in which I am told why Oxford is the right publisher for the book. It does not leave a great impression. So, response from the publisher. Now, if my experience is any indication, editors receive many, many proposals each week. Sometimes I get as many as 15 to 20. So I do my best to stay on top of them and reply within the weeks, and certainly more than 2 weeks, no more than 2 weeks. And if a manuscript is not right for Cambridge University Press, I always suggest those publishers that might be interested in the work. And so finally, the peer review process. So before the pandemic, the peer review would take about 14 to 16 weeks. And I really hope that we can return to this scenario, because since the start of the pandemic, average review time has been more than 6 months. We find it extremely difficult to find reviewers, secure reviewers. Sometimes it takes a month or two just to go through that process. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's always a tussle to get the reviews out. I've come to sending very frequently my get down on my knees and plead for the report email message to somebody who's holding up the process. But it really is taking a long time. And so keep that in mind. It takes a lot of time. And if you're in a rush, you really do need to keep that time factor front and center in terms of your calculations. So that's my basic overview, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Beatrice. I'll get started with a couple things. from the prepared questions that we sent. While we wait to see if anyone's going to add anything in the chat. Let's say someone brings the manuscript to you, and then are you expecting it? Is there an expectation that it will be formatted for your press?
Generally, what we expect is a Word or a PDF document. If you have illustrations, I do not insert them within the manuscript because it creates a really heavy file, and not all computers are compatible with different programs. What I have found is if you do have illustrations, the easiest and the best ways to send them are either put them in a PowerPoint or send them via Dropbox or something like WeTransfer. That's really the best way to go about it.
Sure. Tiffany, let's see your hands up.
Yeah, I have a question. Beatrice, you touched on this somewhat, but I'm wondering if you could expound upon how frequently first-time authors, people turning their dissertation into a book, receive a response of revise and resubmit.
It's very common. I would say about 50% of the time. What I'd like to emphasize is that writing books is really hard. It's really hard. If you think it's you, it's not you. Everybody finds it hard. And it's not just having ideas. It's not just being a great researcher. It's coming up with a structure, a conceptualization, a way that you can really see that argument through from your first opening chapter all the way up to the conclusion. What I have found, and what so many people tell me, that it really helps to take part in a writing group. Testing your ideas, testing your writing is one among the most effective ways to learn what's working and what's working less well within, let's say, a given chapter or even the book as a whole. And even sometimes before you want to send it to a publisher, it's really a good idea to have either some chapters or even somebody, a really wonderful friend or a colleague, take a look at the manuscript so that you can get the feedback that you need before you actually submit it to a publisher. Now, you might not agree with everything that she or he says. And in fact, when you get the peer review reports, let's say you do get a revised and a resubmit verdict, you might not agree with all of the comments that you're getting back and the feedback. But what that feedback does tell you is that something is not working as well as it might. And what I have found is often people say, the author should do this. And maybe that is one way forward. But I found the most successful manuscripts are when the author comes up with the right kind of solution to those sections that are not working quite so well. So as I say, it's a process. And it doesn't happen on the first draft. Everyone is always editing and editing and editing and editing. And even, I have also found as soon as somebody has submitted their manuscript to go in production, within 2 days, many of them are saying, no, here's the better draft. And so I tell them, hold on to those changes. You can make those changes in copy editing. But if I start sending multiple versions of the manuscript to the production people, something is going to get really messed up. So just, keep editing, and you can make all those corrections in copy editing. And even sometimes at the proof stage, people even want to rewrite the book, but you really can't do it at that point because that just becomes really crazy and really expensive. So again, I want to impress, writing is a process. It's a really hard process. You need feedback. You can also check into lots of different kinds of books that offer feedback on how to write successfully as an academic.
To follow up on that, with Cambridge, what kind of infrastructure is in place for the manuscript into the final product in terms of formatting and pictures and all of that?
That's a really, really good question. The good news is you do not have to do any of this. That's what publishers do. We have different formats, different size books, some small, some big. For illustrated books, I like a bigger format than a book that only has straight text. But we work with a design team, and they will place illustrations as near as possible to where they're called out in the text. And you will have obviously the opportunity to review how large or small the images are looking on a page, and whether the captions are in the right place. So that's really what a publisher will do. Now, I know in some very, very tiny presses, in fact, they do expect you to have files completely ready and the whole thing designed and laid out, but that is generally not true of the academic presses with whom you would be working.
And then I'll ask one more question, and then we'll move on to Katie, and then get some more general questions after that at the end. What does the contract look like after the manuscript's been peer reviewed?
Okay, the first principle of contracts is there is no standard contract. So sometimes I will get someone usually married to a lawyer, and they say, well, contracts should state so-and-so, and I keep telling them, no, there are a number of variables we take into account. The length of the book, the larger the book, the more expensive the book, the lower the royalty, because the production costs are that much greater. You know, that means higher level of copy editing costs, paper, the amount of pages that will be required for the book. And that means if it's a very fat book, then it needs a bigger binding. So all of those different factors will come into play. So I think about production costs, I think about the size of the market. I would say that a royalty could be in terms of 5 to 10% of the sales of the book, or the retail price of the book. But again, it really depends on the subject, on the length, on the production costs, all sorts of different variables. In terms of the due delivery date for a book, that is really up to the author. And everybody has a different calendar. What I can say is that if you're expecting us to produce your book inside of a month, not going to happen. Generally, production time for a non-illustrated book, say circa 300, 350 pages, is about 8 months. For an illustrated book, it's about 10 to 12 months, depending if it's a large illustration program or a super large illustration program. But the point there is it's up to you, and you need to keep those timeframes into account, and then work backwards from any kind of deadline, let's say your 3-year review or your 6-year, 10-year review, of when you need that book to come out and what's needed for the review process at each stage of career advancement. You know, we work very hard. I'm deeply sensitive to the issues that early career scholars are facing. So I try very, very hard to work with them and to make sure that they have exactly what they need in their portfolio when they go through those different reviews at the different stages of their careers. So we can be supportive, but only to a point. We can't pull a rabbit out of a hat in the last minute.
Thank you, Beatrice. All right, so now we'll move on to Katie, and then we'll have time for questions after.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me join. I actually have a brief PowerPoint that I'm going to go through, and then there'll certainly be time for questions that anyone may have. So let me just get this started. Is everybody seeing the screen now? Hopefully. Okay, let me just get the slideshow going. Okay. So I'm going to give kind of a brief presentation on how to publish with Brill. There's just my information there. I do ancient Near East and Egyptology, but I'm also responsible for Jewish studies here at Brill. A little bit about Brill. I'm sure most of you know us. We're an international academic publisher established back in the 1600s. We have offices in both Europe and here in Boston, along with a recent acquisition of Vandenhoek and Ruprecht and Berlau that happened last year. So that's now part of our Brill Germany group. We do about 1,400 new book titles per year, 330 journals, as well as online resources, reference works, those kind of things. These are the areas in which we publish, mostly in humanities, a few social sciences and law.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like your screen is frozen.
Oh, okay.
The first slide is, it looks like.
Let's see. Are you seeing a different one now?
Nope, we're still on your whole
On that one.
PowerPoint before getting into the slideshow.
Oh, okay. Well, let me try getting out of it and going back in and see if that works. Okay. Let me try this. Sorry about that. Are you seeing it now?
No, it's
No, it's still frozen.
yeah, it's freezing there. Maybe it's how you're. Do you have two monitors or something, or?
I do have two monitors, but I can hold on one second and I can fix that. Monitor. Okay. Let's see. Are we seeing it now?
Yep.
Okay, and now is it going progressing? Okay,
Yep.
okay, good. We got it. Sorry about that. Okay, so talked a little bit about Brill. There are some pictures of our offices. Okay, so these are the subject areas in which we publish. There is a list of acquisitions editors on our website. So, you know, I know some people overlap maybe with, you know, Dead Sea Scrolls or Old Testament or anything like that. There are different editors for that. So there's a list of who you could be able to contact, and I can certainly share these slides so people can find those links. Okay, now a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about. I know this session is talking more about how to turn a dissertation into a book, but I think there are different levels of that. And sometimes when you're working on revising a dissertation into a book, you may, you know, publish some chapters as articles, you may do them in different ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, is it a book or is it a journal article, the journal article process, as well as the book publication process. I also want to touch on open access publishing, because I know that's something that we get a lot of questions on. And then obviously there's time for some Q&A. So talking about is, you know, is it an article or is it a book? Thinking about what is your preference or motivation? Are you looking, you know, to fulfill tenure requirements? Do you have to have some articles published in addition to books? Thinking about that, and or, you know, maybe you want to put an article out first to get some feedback to help in your revisions of your book. That's something to consider. Again, I know Beatrice touched on timeline. So thinking about your timeline, both for working on the content and when you want to have it published. So here I've kind of separated out a little bit the difference between journal articles and books. Journal articles, obviously, they're shorter in length. The research might be in a little bit more of a preliminary stage and or on a smaller topic. They can appear more quickly. Books, obviously longer in length. We usually say at least 80,000 words, which equates to a book that's roughly 200 pages long. The research is in more of an advanced stage and or on a larger topic, and it can take longer to appear. I did put an asterisk that sometimes a journal article can take longer depending on the journal you apply to. If it's a very popular journal and they have a large backlog, sometimes it can take longer to get an article through and published. And with the book process, sometimes that can be faster than a journal article, again, dependent upon what journal you're submitting to. So this is kind of an overview. So you can send us a proposal. We give an initial response. We may review the proposal internally and or externally with our series editors and editorial boards. We have the full manuscript reviewed as well. Then there's time for revision. Then a final decision is made about the manuscript, and then any final polishing edits are done. And then we start the production process after that. So this is just kind of an outline of how things move through. When you're talking about choosing a journal, Again, Beatrice mentioned this, looking at bibliographies, looking at places where that you use in your own research. Those will probably be the most appropriate places to submit your work. So looking at journals, looking at their aims and scope, looking at what's published there. Look at their submission instructions. Pretty much all journals have those posted online, any specific requirements that they have. Prepare your article according to any requirements that they have, and then submit using their guidelines. I've included a link there that just includes a lot of helpful information about submitting to a journal. Then once you submit, obviously it usually goes to the peer review process and proceeds from there. The difference between looking at an article submission and a book proposal: an article submission in a journal is usually evaluated by the editors of the journal. And then if it's deemed interesting, that it fits with the journal, then it'll start peer review. With a book proposal, that usually comes to us, the acquisitions editors, first, and we'll take a look at it. If I think that it's a fit for one of our series, usually what I'll do is forward it along to the series editor, the editorial board, and say, kind of, what do you think? Sometimes the series editor will come back and say, yeah, I think this is great. Sometimes they'll come back and say, I want to wait to see the full manuscript. It depends a little bit. If we do have a series editor that is interested, we can do a provisional contract at that point. It's provisional only until the manuscript undergoes and passes the peer review process. And then the peer review process, we've found that it's, even with the pandemic, we're mostly getting our peer review of manuscripts done in about 2 to 3 months, roughly. So that's for a full book manuscript. Obviously, there are exceptions. Sometimes it takes longer to find reviewers who are available to review the work, but that's on average about how long it's taking to get the peer review complete. When we're talking about preparing a book proposal, we're looking for like a 1 to 2 page overview of the work, description of it. If the book is based on your doctoral thesis, talk about how you plan on revising it into a manuscript, because we don't publish unrevised dissertations. A description of the proposed readership of your work. Again, I would echo what Beatrice said, in that most of our books are very focused and niche, and so they are not going to be New York Times bestsellers, so just acknowledge that. But be aware of who you're writing to. We ask for a planned table of contents. It can include a summary of the chapters, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And again, give an indication of about how long you think the manuscript will be, just so we have an idea for planning. Again, a good proposal includes general rationale for the book, why the publication is needed, what's unique about it, concise statement and how you're addressing that statement, clear outline of the table of contents. It is helpful to highlight your books, what you're doing in your book in relation to existing books that may be out there. A brief CV is also helpful, a sample chapter if you have it, but it's not required. Turning your thesis into a monograph. I know Beatrice talked about this at length, which was very helpful. But again, removing all reference to your thesis or dissertation, looking at the introductory chapter, is it really necessary? Fine-tuning your bibliography, thinking about copyright and permissions, asking others that colleagues, friends, for help if they've gone through this process already. What I like to say is that usually when you talk about a monograph versus the thesis, you're talking about taking the core of your thesis research and really, pinpointing that and pinpointing the one focus of that, and kind of getting rid of the background information that your thesis has to it has to include for a thesis, but that we don't need for a monograph, bearing in mind that the people who read your book are going to have all that background information, because presumably they're all going to be specialists in this area as well. So it's really, finding your core argument and expanding upon that and presenting it in a cohesive way. next step. So once we get the proposal, like I said, I usually share it with a series editor. If they're interested, we can do the provisional agreement. Once we get the full manuscript for review, as I said, it usually takes about 2 to 3 months for a book manuscript to be reviewed, usually about 4 to 6 weeks for journal articles. But again, that really depends on the journal. If the journal is very popular and has a lot of submissions, it can often take longer. We do our peer review on a double-blind basis, meaning that neither you nor the reviewer know each other's identities. We do that to try and keep the comments as candid as possible and to give you the best feedback as possible. Once the review is complete, you have time to make any suggested revisions. Usually a series editor or perhaps the original reviewer will look at the revised version again to help us determine if it's ready to go. And then once the manuscript is fully accepted and we receive the final files for production, it takes 6 months for the book to appear in print and online, and they're published simultaneously in print and online. Talking about preparing a book manuscript, we have this author guide on our website that is very detailed. But of course, if you have any questions, your acquisitions editor is there ready to help answer any of those questions. It's important to remember high resolution images if you're using them, that we do need the high res versions, also that you acquire the permissions to use the images in the book. All of your content and revisions should be final at the point where we're starting production. So there aren't major edits being done during proofing. Proofing is mostly to check for small typos or other small errors. Any non-standard font needs to be a Unicode font, and that's so that our ebooks work properly on our platform. And usually the index is created at first proofs when the pagination is set. Talking a little bit about open access, obviously Brill does publish in open access. We do about 70 to 80 books per year. We also have open access journals, and we also have the possibility of publishing articles in open access. Why would we suggest open access? Obviously, we ensure quality control because all our open access content still goes through the peer review process, but it maximizes visibility. We found, of course, that open access articles are downloaded more often, cited more often. The authors retain the copyright. There are various Creative Commons licenses that are used for open access publishing, and your editor can help you learn about those as well. But it also helps, I know that some research funders require open access publishing, and we can comply with those requirements. There are various ways to get funding for open access. Some universities have set up funding specifically for open access fees. Some research funders build that into their grant applications. Brill also has institutional open access agreements. We have these in a few different places. They're not everywhere yet, but in a few different places we have agreements where if you're affiliated with a certain institution, you can publish in our journals in open access for free. We also work with Knowledge Unlatched, which is kind of a crowdfunding way to turn published material open access. And different lists and different books are included every year for that. And places where there are links, there's more information about those different options. This is just talking a little bit more about the different places where you can get funding. So again, I mentioned institutional open access, the open access agreements that Brill has with certain institutions, and then the Knowledge Unlatched. We found that with open access, our articles or content is downloaded 4 times more. You have 1.5 times more citations, and there tends to be more of a global readership. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. I didn't know, I can certainly touch on some of the questions that you sent to me ahead of time. Owen,
that'd be great.
Yeah, okay, so there was a question about how crucial is it to research the type of work published in the past? Do specific publishers accept only certain types of scholarship? I don't think that you need to do necessarily in-depth research on on a publisher, but I think that, again, as Beatrice mentioned and I mentioned earlier, look at the publishers that you're using in your own research, look at who's publishing that content, and that's probably a very good indication of where your work would best fit. And I guess let me speak for Brill. Brill doesn't necessarily, have a rule about what kind of scholarship we'll accept. I mean, for the most part, if we get a proposal and we think that the content is of good quality and our series editors and editorial boards agree with us, then we're going to pursue it in publishing it. We don't have rules about like, oh, well, this is only public, only touching on this. So we haven't published that before, so we're not going to touch it. I think for the most part, we're saying if it's good quality scholarship, then we would like to publish it. There was another question about the peer review process in terms of, do authors need to send in a list of potential reviewers? You don't have to. That's why we rely a lot on our editors and editorial boards to help us locate appropriate peer reviewers. But certainly, if you have some suggestions in mind, we will take them under consideration. That's not saying that we'll necessarily use them, but we will certainly take them under consideration for sure.
Do you allow people you don't know as a reviewer?
Yes, you can also send that, and we have had that come before. If there's, yes, certainly people have said to us, if you could please not send it to this person. Yes, we absolutely would allow that and adhere to that. So, yep. All right.
The question in the chat, one that we asked, what do you have minimum and maximum word counts for monographs?
So for books, we have a minimum word count, which is 80,000 words. That equates to a book that's about 200 pages. When we talk about our standard trim size, which is this, the usual like 6x9 size, we don't have a maximum word count, but bearing in mind that when you get really high up there with your word count, there is a consideration of how many pages we can fit in one binding and how expensive the book will be and those kind of things. So something to bear in mind. I think our maximum page count for our standard size is around 1,000 pages. So that's a lot, but it's not to say it hasn't been done before, but just bear in mind that the bigger it is, the more expensive it is for us to produce too, and the more, and that is usually reflected in the price. So.
All right, I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat now, so I think we'll open up to both Katie and Beatrice, and I'll just start going through some of these questions, and you can both chime in as input on. The first one is about printing methods at both. For first monographs, what kind of method do you favor? Offset, digital, print on demand, include sewn bindings, etc.?
Sure. Oh, Beatrice, you're muted. So if you want to go first, you can.
No, it's okay. You go ahead.
Okay. So I would say that for the most part, all of our books that are done in our standard trim size are now done print on demand. And so they're printed digitally on demand and then also obviously available as ebooks online. The exception to that is if we do our large trim size, those are always done offset. So that would be an exception. But with the benefit of doing a print on demand, at least that we found, is that with the digital printing, obviously it is less expensive to produce them that way. And it does allow us to include color images throughout the book. Because it isn't as expensive to produce them. When we do the larger trim sizes that are offset, we do, if there are color images, we do have to restrict them to a smaller plate section at the back of the book. So that's something to keep in mind. I know some people, for some books more so than others, color images are more important. So it's kind of weighing which is better for you. So.
I would agree with all of that, although again, it depends on the kind of the book. So some books we will go straight to POD, and another benefit of that is that we start out generally in hardcover, and then we can go into a paperback edition much sooner than if we're holding stock for 2-3 years. We need to sell it through.
Right.
Generally speaking, for my illustrated books, and I have many of them, I prefer not to go the POD route. POD is a wonderful thing. Not so great though with illustrations. The quality of the reproduction I have found is not all that high. It is wonderful though that color is a whole lot more cheaper, but generally speaking, I find that it's still better to print. I also find that at least some suppliers don't have the kinds of paper that you need for really accurate reproduction. So instead of having a coated stock, that kind of shiny paper, they only will have an uncoated stock, and therefore that's one of the reasons that the illustrations are a little bit blurrier and they're not as crisp and sharp as they want to be. But again, it really depends on the type of the book. So there's no, we take a very kind of case study approach to each of the books that we publish, rather than have a kind of one size fits all rule.
Thank you. Another question is about another kind of in a similar vein is how does indexing work? Do publishers handle that, or is that expected of the authors?
I'll start with that one. We expect all of our authors to do their own indices for two very important reasons. One, no one knows the book as well as the author. And oftentimes people say, well, I can get money, I can pay somebody to do it. I have yet to meet an author who is happy with the work of a so-called professional indexer. The indexer will do the basics, but he or she will just not really know enough to really get into the heart of the book and include the kinds of entries that a serious scholar will want to see. The second is the cost. For most monographs, or in fact, I can't think of any monograph, the publisher just cannot afford to pay for an index, which usually runs to about $1,500 or $1,800. So it's quite an expensive thing, and it adds considerably to the cost of the book. Now, with the index, in the wonderful digital world in which we're working, it no longer suffices just to have this thing at the end of the book. You want to be able to have a dynamic index. And so we supply our authors with lots and lots of information and training for how to do that. But essentially, you are becoming a programmer to program all those terms and to make sure that when you do a search for a certain term like Babylon, you can find Babylon all through that text. So it is labor intensive. There's no question about it. But that is what the expectation is. And again, we hold your hand through that process.
Yeah, so it's similar at Brill. We also ask authors to prepare an index, but there are a couple different ways in which they can do it. We usually ask that it's done at first proofs, obviously, because at that point, pagination is set. So there are a couple different ways that you can do it. There is a way to go through and tag index terms as you're writing the manuscript in Word. And if you do it that way, then it's a matter of our typesetters will just take the terms that you've tagged and create the index. So that's one way to do it, but you kind of have to know that you're going to do that at the beginning to start. It's a lot harder to go back through and add those tags later. Another option is just to have your list of index terms, and then you have to go through and add the page numbers at first proofs. We can, when asked, we can obviously provide freelancers. I would agree with Beatrice that yes, you may not be happy with the outcome if you have a freelancer index it. But that is, of course, an option if that's something that you want to do. But, we also provide a lot of instructions on how to compile the index and put that together. The thing that I like to say to authors who might be feeling overwhelmed by the idea of compiling an index is to think of it like coming up with keywords for each chapter. So kind of look at each chapter like an article where you supply keywords and kind of start with those keywords as the basis of your index and go from there. So.
Good. Thank you for that. We have a few more questions, so I'll try to run through some of them here. When choosing, this one's about choosing a publisher. How important is prestige? Is it okay with a smaller university press? Or what do you think? What's your opinion on that?
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess it depends. It's interesting because so Brill being a European publisher, there are even differences with how it's perceived in Europe versus how it's perceived in the US. So sometimes I hear from authors that are US based that, oh, well, you know, my tenure committee doesn't really know Brill, so I don't know if that would be the best option for getting a book published. Sometimes I'd hear that in the US, whereas in Europe, that's maybe not necessarily the case. So again, I think this comes back to thinking what are you trying to accomplish with this book? If this book is, you know, part of a tenure application, then maybe it is something to consider, and that might be worth talking to your colleagues who would know better, you know, whether or not Brill would be a fit. I mean, maybe Brill is a fit for a different book project. But if you could, you know, I think there would be colleagues perhaps in your department that might be able to kind of give you a better idea of what would be an acceptable publisher for a tenure application versus another book project.
I would agree with all of that. It also depends on the book and it depends on the institution. So some institutions are not very fussy about where you publish with, but the higher, let's start with Research One universities in the US. They will be very, very fussy about your publisher, and they will want to see a institution that has a reputation and is well known. Cambridge is fortunately in a position where it is well known both nationally and internationally. And we have found that it does help often to have a publication with Cambridge in a tenure or a third year review situation. But then when you go down the research track, you know, to our two institutions, small liberal arts colleges, and then even community colleges, I think it doesn't matter quite as much. I think they just need you to publish, because that is what the dean needs in order to show in terms of statistics to the person and the provost and the president, and then often the state. It shows that there is still a lot of activity. Very unfortunately, teaching is not considered really enough these days. It's all about publications. I personally think this is wrong. I think that there's so much that teaching brings to a certain educational institution, but publishing is what is demanded. And there are a lot of publishers out there. So depending on where you are, you will find a publisher for your work. Again, as Katie has indicated, talk to your colleagues about what they recommend. Talk to your department chair, who is absolutely critical in giving you the right advice, so that he or she can advance your case through those different kind of pegs as you work through your career.
I had a question asking about other languages. Do either of your publications accept foreign language, or do they need to be translated into English?
At Cambridge, everything is published in English. So we will not publish in any other language, but I know that it really, again, depends on the publisher.
Yeah, we do occasionally publish in other languages. It does depend a bit on the subject area. You know, in the ancient Near East, I think German and French are still somewhat acceptable. But bear in mind that for the most part, you know, if you publish in English, you're going to reach a broader audience. So it is, you know, a bit preferable to be in English, but we will certainly look at other languages, you know, manuscripts in other languages as well.
A note in the chats about the previous conversation from Tiffany. She said, as someone at ASOR, I was told that my press needed to have the words university press in the title to make my case unambiguous.
Yeah.
All right, let's see what other questions we have here. How much time are you given generally from contract to having the finished product?
It really is kind of up to the author. I would say usually within a couple of years. I guess it depends on at what state your manuscript is in when you contact us. But, you know, when we're putting a date into a contract, we kind of say, okay, when do you think you're going to have it ready? And then even once that date is in the contract, you know, we may have people come back to us. Certainly the pandemic is a perfect example where things were delayed. But as long as people are in touch with us and just keep us up to date on what's going on, you know, that date is a bit flexible. But really it's up to you. If you're still really kind of in the beginning, then maybe you want to give yourself a couple of years, but maybe if you're thinking, oh, I only have a couple more chapters that I'm still revising, then maybe a little bit less. Yeah, it's really up to you.
Absolutely. But the other thing I've also discovered is even when I suggest to people, what's a realistic delivery date? Things happen. Writing is a very mysterious thing. You know, you're writing along and then you realize, oh, I really don't know what I am talking about here. And so sometimes things just take longer. Sometimes you actually stumble upon something that really changes the cast of the book and you have to write another 2 chapters on something. So, again, it's very, very flexible. Ideally, we will receive the manuscript within 2, even sometimes 5 years of the contract. I've waited for books for 10 years, so things happen.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's see here. From a CV perspective, how much is that taken into consideration and apart from the manuscript itself? So is someone from not from a university or from a non-top tier university, will they be accepted if they're, I'm expanding the question a little bit. So yeah, if their manuscript is of a certain quality, will they still be accepted?
Absolutely. You know, I know that it's a very, very challenged job market, and people coming from top tier institutions, or let's say, you know, their first job is with a non-top tier, you know, institution. So I don't look at where they teach. I look at where they've gotten their degree, and I look at the topic, and I take a close look at the proposal to see whether it makes sense and whether there's something really new and interesting and original there. That to me is really the primary criteria.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. We're really looking more at the content of the manuscript more than anything else, for sure.
Is there a certain time frame that you would recommend getting a dissertation revised and published before it's too late, or do you need a certain amount of time before?
Yeah. I don't think there's, you know, we don't necessarily say, oh, you have to publish your dissertation within whatever 5 years of finishing it or something like that. I think it depends on the person. I mean, I've seen dissertations that are published shortly after they've been completed, you know, revised. And I've seen ones that it's been years later and somebody's like, oh, I really, you know, kind of want to go back to this and revisit it. I think it's a mix. I think mostly people are doing it within a few years of having finished their dissertation, but also recognizing that sometimes people need to give themselves, you know, a little bit of distance from the dissertation, you know, maybe not going right from finishing the dissertation into revising the dissertation. Some people do, and that's fine, but also some people need a little distance before they can kind of come back to it and revise it. But I wouldn't say that there's a set time frame that you have to publish your dissertation by.
That is absolutely so. I would add to that let's think a little bit about what some major research universities, like the top state universities, require. Generally, it's 1 book and 6 articles over 3-year terms. So that's publishing an article a year, and then over that period, getting the book together. When you get to some institutions like the Ivy League, Stanford, Berkeley, Michigan, you know, the really, really top tier state universities, then they want to see all of that plus headway, if not completion of even a 2nd book. So, you know, again, some of these decisions are determined by where you are in the kind of institution that you are teaching at. If you know that you need those 6 articles in one book, you're going to get that one book out because it's expected to be part of your portfolio that you submit for the tenure decision. And then you have to, plan wisely. Let's say you do have that aha moment and you discover, oh my goodness, this is really important. But that tenure deadline is coming along. You're going to have to think very carefully about what to do about that aha moment. Maybe publish that new information as articles so that you can get that book out. With many institutions, the book has become the sacred cow. They really do want to see it, and they want to see it out. Some institutions are a little bit more flexible as long as it's in production and you can flag some page proofs at them so that they see it's really going to happen. That can sometimes work as well. So again, this is exactly the kinds of things you need to discuss with your department chair so that it's absolutely clear what is needed at which point.
Great. We're at time. I do have one more question in the comments that I think is a good kind of a little different than what's been asked previously. So I'll ask that and then we'll wrap up. Question says, for those still in the writing stage of their dissertation, is there advice you can give to make the conversion to a monograph as smooth as possible?
One thing you can do is, as I suggested, to consult with some books. There's a book called Dreyer's English, Dreyers, which is very good about stylistic issues. Helen Sword, Sword, has a couple of books out specifically about academic writing, and you might find her work really, really important. I can't stress enough how important it is to share your work with your colleagues. Get feedback, get it early, and get it often. Because as we have alluded to at various points, sometimes you're just too close to your work and you can't see it yourself. So you need somebody else to really read it for you and say, this passage is really not clear, or I'm not following your argument, or this is brilliant, this is fabulous, keep going. If every chapter is like this, you're in really great shape. So, you just need that second or third party to really help you, gain some distance and also see what's working really well. And then the sections that maybe need a little bit of improvement.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. Absolutely, colleagues' feedback is probably the most helpful. And again, another thing to consider, which I alluded to when I was speaking earlier, is if you can, or if you find that you can do parts of it as journal articles, that will also provide some feedback and give you, because presumably going through the peer review process with at least part of it as an article will provide some suggestions for revisions that you may find helpful in other parts of the work as well. So.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much to Beatrice and to Katie, and thank you to everyone who took some time over lunch to come and join us. We'll see you next.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.